Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on September 29th with Sarah Cochran. She will be giving a presentation entitled Missing Reward: Locating Widows, Spinsters, and Bachelors. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Laura Lefler. Before we begin, here is a little bit about Laura. Laura has a Bachelor of Arts in English and History from BYU. She is a retired English and U.S. history teacher. She also has a Salt Lake Community College genealogy certificate, a ProGen certificate, and is an ICAP Gen accredited genealogist with a focus on the Upper South, which includes Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. All of her ancestors are from the Upper South, and she has spent most of her childhood living throughout the South and loved it. For the past 5 years, she has been a volunteer at the BYU Family History Library in Provo, Utah, helping patrons with their family history. And if Laura is ready, we'll turn the time over to her.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone, and let's get started. So let's find out if this class is for you. I want you to circle the letter that best describes your research. A. Do you continually run into brick walls? Do you often feel like pulling your hair out? Are you stuck in Western North Carolina, East Tennessee, or anywhere in Georgia in the 1800s? Or B, does it feel like you're on the yellow brick road and you know exactly where you're going? Your research has already been done, it's documented, and you can trace your family to the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620. If you answered A, then this class is going to help you. This presentation is geared toward the beginner, but hopefully there'll be some ideas in here for all of you who are more experienced researchers. The objective for this class is number one, to provide some historical context for why it's more difficult to research in the South. Number two, I want to introduce you to some go-to records for Southern research. And number three, let's focus on the value of census records in Southern research. So we're going to begin with a quick review of the research process that's going to lead up to selecting records for Southern research. The research process has 5 steps. Preliminary research are the first 2 steps. Number one, you're to identify what you know about your family. This means you've gone around, you've interviewed family members, you've collected all the stories, you've reviewed all the family records and memorabilia, you've looked at online trees for all the hints and documentation you can find. That's step one. Then you move to step 2, which is decide what you want to learn about your family now that you've learned all this. You choose a narrow, specific goal. For example, my goal is I want to find the parents of Samuel Edward Tipton, who was born about 1873 in Georgia and died in May 1932 in Florida. So then you're ready for number 3. Now that you've completed those steps, you're ready to select records to search. And to determine what records to research, it's vital that you know some background about the area you're looking at. Differences between the North and South started from the very beginning of settlement. The first permanent settlement by the English in this country was in Jamestown in 1607 by the Virginia Company. It was a company with investors, so their motivation was making money. They were hoping they'd find gold and become rich just like Spain had, but they didn't find any gold. They instead discovered something better. They figured out that tobacco could be grown. It became their cash crop. The Virginia Company became successful when they focused on agriculture. On the other hand, the motivation for the Pilgrims and the Puritans was the religious freedom. The Pilgrims wanted to separate from the Church of England, which is also known as the Anglican Church, and the Puritans wanted to reform the Church of England. The South was perfect for a society based on agriculture. They had cash crops like rice and indigo, tobacco, and later cotton, but all of these crops required extremely large tracts of land. In the North, the land was too rocky and poor for farming cash crops, so their economics included the fishing and the whaling industry. They had many skilled craftsmen and merchants. And later, there's going to be textile mills in the North that are processing the cotton from the South. So the factory system is going to rise in the North. Over 80% of people in the South were farmers, and farmers moved more. It was not uncommon for each generation to move to a different place. There were crop failures, and crop rotation wasn't even known until the 1930s. So farmers wore out their land planting the same crop year after year, like tobacco and cotton. Farmers had to keep moving on looking for better land. And because they were constantly on the move, that makes them hard to track down. Whereas up north in New England, settlements were in close-knit communities of towns and villages. The closer social relationships in those towns created the need for town meetings, which are going to create town records. So the North had more local records, and the New Englanders moved less, so they're not so hard to track down. In the rural South, children began their education at home. Plantation owners, wealthy people, they hired their tutors to teach their children. But yeoman farmers, which is another name for small farmers, and those that had no land often didn't have the money to hire a tutor. Because there was no compulsory schooling in the South, many were left uneducated. So if your ancestors could not read or write, then you're probably not going to find a family Bible or diaries or family histories, etc. But up north in New England, those Puritans had a huge impact on education because their focus was on religion. They wanted their kids to read the Bible. So by 1642, free compulsory education was in place in Massachusetts. If you have more education, you're going to have more records. I really like this map. This is a map showing the areas in 1760 where European groups settled in America. So see all this yellow right here? The yellow area is where the English settled all along the eastern seaboard. And these blue stripes right here and right here, that indicates that 30% of the local population were enslaved Africans. The pink area up here is New York and New Jersey. That's where the Dutch settled. But by the time the Germans and the Scots-Irish arrived, most of this east was already claimed by the English. So the Scots-Irish and the German are the purple, and the green is where the Scots-Irish settled. They're further west. The orange colors down here, that's where the Scottish settled in parts of North Carolina, South Carolina, and then some down here in Georgia. Now, I want you to think about this map of where these different groups are settled as you look at this next map on religion. This is a map of religion in America in 1760. So I want you to look at the background colors, starting up here in New England in this blue area. And these colors right here represent if there was an official religion or not. So the official religion in 1760 in New England area were the Puritans. It was also known as a Congregationalist religion. This brown area represents where the official religion was the Anglican, the Church of England, which is later going to be known as the Episcopal Church. And the Anglican Church was really strong in southern states, and it functioned as a state church, which meant people were required to pay taxes to support the church. This yellow area represented in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and up here in Rhode Island, there was no official religion there. You know why, don't you? You know why there's no official religion here? It's because the people that settled here are all the people who were kicked out by the Puritans. That's who settled Rhode Island. I want you to notice where the Baptists primarily were in 1760. They're up here in Rhode Island, that orange cross, and then over here, there's an orange cross here. So these are primarily where the Baptists were in 1760. There was a man by the name of Schubel Stearns, and he had grown up Congregationalist, but he was converted to the Baptist religion, and he wanted to take religion to the South, the Baptist religion, because the Southern colonies once had the lowest rates of church attendance, probably mostly because there were so few churches there. So in about 1751, Schubel Stearns starts bringing religion to the South, and he comes down into Virginia, and he preaches in Virginia and establishes Baptist churches there, and then he comes down into North Carolina, into the area what is now Randolph County, and established the Sandy Creek Baptist Church, which became like the mother of Baptist churches in the South. Lots of churches came out of Schubel Stearns Church in the Sandy Creek Baptist Church. Also, I want you to notice these purple crosses right here. These purple crosses were the Presbyterians. And if you look back on the map before, look who's settling there, that's the Scots-Irish. So if you have Scots-Irish ancestry, you want to be looking in the Presbyterian church records. Okay, let's see, what's next? Oh, look at this cool map. Okay, this is religion in the South 150 years later. By 1800, Methodists and Baptists were becoming the fastest growing religions in the nation. This map shows you where the predominant religion in United States counties was in 1906. So all of these little beige boxes, those are counties where the predominant religion are Methodists. And look here in the Baptists, all the Baptist churches, counties that are predominantly Baptist. So if your ancestor lived in a rural environment, there may have been circuit riding Baptist or Methodist or Presbyterian preachers who traveled on horseback from church to church. The preacher may have come only once a month to a little church on his circuit, and that preacher may have placed the record of a baptism or marriage or death that he officiated at in a different location than where it was performed, or he may not have recorded it at all. Another thing to think about, if your family lived in a rural or remote area, your family may have decided to get baptized or married by the next preacher, didn't matter what denomination, that came into their area. So when you're looking for church records in the South, you want to spread your net wide so that you can find, might be in a different church, might be not where you think it should be. Church records are extremely valuable, but you must know that there are less records to be found for Methodist and Baptist churches. And then there's those burned counties, which are more prevalent in the South. The phrase burned counties came from doing research in Virginia, where many county records were destroyed in courthouse fires or during the Civil War. Look at this map. These are the major battles in the Civil War. Look at all the battles in Virginia. Remember, Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, and those Northerners are coming down there trying to destroy the capital, capture the capital. Besides that, burned counties also refer to courthouses where natural disasters like fire, flood, earthquakes, tornadoes, insects, rodents, you name it, whatever happened that could have destroyed records. But just know there are more burned counties in the South than in the North. So knowing history and the background of an area is going to help you determine which record types to use, and maybe even help you understand what might be available. So this is going to lead us to our second objective, which is what are some of the best record types for Southern research if we're trying to prove relationships, which is how you get back another generation. Census records, vital records, cemetery records, land, military, probate, tax records. These are the first go-to when you're doing Southern research. If you find these records when you're researching your family, you can discover amazing things like birth, marriage, death information. You could possibly find the names of parents, other family members, their military service, their religious affiliation. You may be able to identify children who were born and died between censuses. You might learn the maiden names of women, the location of land your ancestor owned, and their former residence. And you may learn how wealthy or poor they were. These record types are fantastic for establishing relationships and helping you determine between men of the same name in the same area, which is a problem in the South that everybody seems to encounter. So, which record type would I start with? I start with the census. The Census Bureau has conducted a census every 10 years since 1790. The 1950 census was just made available for us to research this year. Examining a family from one census year to another is a valuable tool to learn about family relationships. And here is a quote by Val Greenwood. He was the author of The Researcher's Guide to American Genealogy. And this is what he says, quote, "There is probably no other single group of records in existence which contain more information about persons and families who lived during the 1800s than do the population schedules of the United States federal censuses." So pay attention to censuses. So I'm going to show you a personal example that I research example using census records. So up here in the upper left-hand corner is a slide of my sweet grandmother. Her name was Evelyn Tipton. When I interviewed her many, many years ago, she told me that her mother, Clara Julian, had died when she was 9 years old, and that her father, Marion Harrison Tipton, had died when she was 12. My grandmother had very few memories of her parents at all, and she had no memories of her grandparents. She did know that her grandfather's name was David M.C. Tipton and that his wife was Sophronia Hopkins. She was told that her grandfather owned a mill and that he died on Roan Mountain in Carter County, Tennessee, before she was born. But that was all that my grandmother could tell me. I interviewed other family members. I collected and gathered as much as I could find. I found a second cousin who had some family history notes corroborating the names of David Tipton and Sophronia Hopkins, but that was it. I couldn't find any artifacts, and this was a way long time before there was any online research. So I went to number 2, set a research goal. What did I want to learn? I wanted to learn the birth, marriage, and death information for David M.C. Tipton. So then I select records to search, and I'm going to start with the census. So that being said, here are a few tips when you're working with census records. You want to make sure you search for all the censuses that an ancestor could have appeared in during his or her lifetime. That's called a census survey. And you want to look for the entire family. We're talking parents and children, because one census is only one picture of one day in 1 year of a family, and you want a bigger picture than just that. So you want to start from the most recent census your ancestor and his family were in, and you want to work backwards. You do not get hung up on spelling. Maybe that enumerator couldn't understand an accent and wrote down what he thought he heard. Use a variety of spellings when you're searching how the surname may have been spelled. And also, you do not want to forget to look for nicknames and initials, which are very common in the South. Mistakes are common too. So that's another reason why you should look at all of the censuses. You don't know who gave the information to the enumerator when he came to the door. Maybe it was a child, or it was an elderly person, or maybe your family wasn't even home when the enumerator wrote down. So the enumerator wrote down what he thought might be happening in that household, or maybe he went to a neighbor's house and asked them what they knew, and maybe they didn't know much. So that's why it's important to do a census survey of every census possible. So my favorite way to get to a census record is to Google what I'm looking for. Google is my friend. In this case, since the last place that David M.C. Tipton was known to live was Tennessee, I'm going to Google Tennessee Census Family Search. My grandmother was, excuse me, I skipped my notes here. Number 2, it's going to up pops your link. So you're going to click on that. And then this is going to bring you to a wiki page with links to all the censuses at Family Search or Ancestry.com. If you have an Ancestry account, I would encourage you to click on Ancestry first because it's easier. Family Search is great, but Ancestry.com is a little easier to find census records. So then Ancestry census search page pops up, and you're going to fill in what you know. But remember, sometimes less information is better. So I'm going to put in his name, David M.C. Tipton. I know he lived in Carter County, Tennessee, and this is very small, you can't see. And I know his wife was Sophronia Hopkins. And then I'm going to hit search. And number 5, Ancestry is going to pull up all of the David Tiptons, starting from the closest match in name and location to perhaps a name variant, and then it's going to start moving further away. You're going to click View Record. You always want to click View Record because that will pull up the original record. Remember that well-meaning transcribers may have transcribed incorrectly, and sometimes it's just the enumerator had illegible handwriting or the document is hard to read. Maybe you can look at it and you can decipher what the enumerator was not able, or what the transcriber was not able to transcribe correctly. So on this slide is a screen capture of David M.C. Tipton's household in 1900, in the 1900 Carter County, Tennessee census. There he is, David M.C. Tipton. And Marion H. Tipton, his son, is living right next door. This census record substantiates what my grandmother stated. She said her parents were Clara Julian. There's Clara. Her dad was Marion Harrison Tipton. And she said her grandparents' names were David M.C. Tipton. And she said Sophronia. This says Sophrona. So it's always important to look at the people that are living close by the person that you're searching for, because they're often related. Remember, when children grow up, it's common for them to receive a piece of land from their parents' property. So you can often find married sons, married daughters with their married name living nearby. And when you find a family you're searching for, you want to make it a habit to look at the names 2 pages before and 2 pages after to see if you can find any other family members listed. Putting the family members together is a great strategy because you can know all the family members. That will help you separate people of the same name living in the same area. Okay, now the next census that David M.C. Tipton would be in would be the 1890 census, but the 1890 federal census was destroyed by fire. But there was an 1890 Veterans Census Schedule that was created. So if your ancestor was between the ages of 16 to 60, between 1861 to 1865, he may have served in the Civil War, which means his birth year would typically have been between 1801 and 1849. So you'll find the 1890 Veterans Schedule in Ancestry. It was a special census conducted in 1890 trying to identify all those who had served in the United States forces, the Union forces, during the Civil War. Remember, about 100,000 Southerners fought for the Union. So it's always worth checking. And you know, sometimes those Southerners switch sides in the middle of the Civil War. So it's always worth checking. And then also some enumerators who were doing the 1890 veteran schedule included Confederate soldiers and even some soldiers who served in other wars. So most, also keep in mind, most of the veteran schedule records for states A through K, which is Alabama through Kansas, part of Kentucky, were destroyed. So when I viewed the record on the 1890 veteran schedule, it listed Daniel M. Tipton. I thought, I don't have a Daniel M. Tipton. But my ancestor was David M.C. Tipton in Carter County, Tennessee. So I am going to look at the original and see if maybe there was a transcription error. So when I click on the original record, I can see why the indexer thought that might be Daniel. But it's not, it's David. And I know that because I looked at other entries made by this enumerator when he was writing everybody's name down. I looked to see how he formed his D. He never closed that little circle for small d on any and on his anytime he made an entry. So I know that that is not Daniel, that's David M. Tipton. That's my ancestor. And here's what I can learn. He was a private, Company D, Regiment 3 of the Mounted Infantry. I know when he was enlisted. He enlisted in 1864. He was discharged in 1865. He served 1 year, 2 months, 4 days. And even what's more cool is down here on the bottom of the veteran schedule, it lists the closest post office address to where your ancestor lived. Shell Creek, Tennessee is on Roan Mountain. So that's where my ancestor lived. And then there's this disability column where you're supposed to write down what your disability was, but he just said, apparently he had a disability because he was run over by horses. I would love to know the story behind that. Okay, now I'm going to look at the 1880 census. It pops up Mitchell County, North Carolina. I think, oh my gosh, it's a whole different state, but Carter County and Mitchell County border each other. Carter County, Tennessee, they're right next to each other. So it's very possible they just moved a little distance. I want you to notice on this one that the initials have been used. DMC Tipton, not David. It's his initials. The oldest son is Marion H, right here. He's just a perfect age for my grandmother's father, who's named Mary Harrison Tipton. And in the 1880 census, they include the relationship of the members of the family to the head of the household. So Marion H is listed as a son of DMC Tipton. Sophrona is listed as his wife, and these are more children. It includes, you can learn about occupation, disability, place of birth, and then place of birth of the parents. And remember, you're going to notice who's living around an ancestor because they're possibly family. So look at this. My grandmother said her grandmother's name was Sophronia Hopkins. And next door, there is an Emmeline Hobson. That's kind of close, don't you think? And notice that Emmeline Hobson is the head of the family, and she has a brother named Marion living with her. Her husband's probably been killed in the Civil War, most likely. Is it possible that Emmeline and Marion could be the siblings of Sophrona? Maybe they made a mistake. It was, my grandmother thought it was Hopkins, but it was really Hobson, that she didn't know them at all. I want you to keep in mind that it's very common in the South for parents to name their children after their siblings. Now, can you see what a horrendous problem this is going to cause? If you have 4 brothers in the Tipton family, or any family for that matter, and they name their sons after their brothers, you could have multiple men with the same name living in the same area. Sophrona here has a daughter named Emma. And I know from research that this is her sister, and she has a sister named Emmeline. Sophrona have a son named Marion Harrison Tipton, and Sophrona had a brother named Marion. So that's a good way to see that families are associated with each other. I couldn't find an 1870 census for David Tipton. I couldn't find any variant of his name. But in the 1860 census, there was a 19-year-old David Tipton, Typton, in the household of Wiley Tipton in Yancey County, North Carolina. Now we're in a different county again. There's no relationship to the head of the household listed in the 1860 census. So I'm going to have to do some more research to determine if the David M.C. Tipton really is the son of Wiley Tipton and Isabella. Oh, remember, we're going to look around. Living next door is John D. Tipton with probably his wife, Carolyn. This guy is 24 years old. He could possibly be a brother living next door. So that's something that I'm going to want to pursue and check on. So here's some things to consider. David Tipton was in Mitchell County in 1880. There's the 1880 census. Here's Mitchell County. And in Yancey County in 1860. There's Yancey County. So where is Yancey County in conjunction with Mitchell County? Obviously, Mitchell County was created as a county in 1861 out of Yancey County. So that means that probably the Tipton didn't move at all, but the county boundaries did. So always be aware of county boundaries. And you can find this research tool if you go into the state and look for, and the Research Wiki and Family Search for changing of boundaries. Here's the 1850 census. This was the first census that listed all the members of a household, but it didn't show any relationship to the head. And this is a family of Wiley, Tipton, and Isabel. Okay, now look what they did. They put all the guys together, all the men. They said all of them are from Kentucky. That's new. They've been North Carolina and the other ones. And then they've got all the women together. But make sure when you see an entry on the bottom of the page, and this was the last entry on the bottom of a page, you always want to make sure to check the following page because there's 3 children on the following page that belong to that family. And look, John D. Tipton is listed in the household of Wiley Tipton. 10 years earlier, in the last census we looked at, he was living next door. So Wiley had probably given or sold some of his farm to John D. And it's very likely that John D. is the older brother to David. I want you to notice the age gap. 13 years, 8 years. Now, there was no birth control back then. So children were generally born every 2 years. So when you see a bigger gap than 2 or 3 years, it's very possible there was a miscarriage or a child has died. And because David M.C. Tipton, my ancestor, is only 8 years old, he's not going to appear in any other earlier censuses. So I'm going to take all I learned and I'm going to put it into a census survey. Here is an example of a census survey format. So what did we learn by doing a census survey for David M.C. Tipton? Our original research goal was to learn about his birth, his marriage, and his death. The 1900 census gave us a month and a year for his birth and North Carolina as a probable birthplace. And I want you to notice how consistent the censuses were. In 1900, he was 59. In 1880, he was 39. In 1860, he was 19. And in 1850, he was 8 years old. That's pretty darn consistent. So the 1900 census also stated that David and Sophrona had been married for 39 years. So that makes his marriage year about 1861. So now we have a range for a marriage record. And we know that in 1861 that we're going to look in 2 counties, Yancey or Mitchell, because Mitchell was created in 1861 out of Yancey, for a probable location of a marriage record. We also know that David Tipton was alive in 1900 but he died before my grandmother was born in 1908. So how can we pinpoint the death date? Well, the census is going to lead us to other records like cemetery records or vital records, and hopefully that will show a death date. If I wanted to learn more about David MC Tipton's parents, I could look at earlier censuses. By the way, I know it's Wiley. Okay, I could look at earlier census 1790 to 1840, but they only list the name of the head of the family, which is usually a male. But if a male died, then his wife should be listed as the head of the family. All of the other members of the family are recorded as male or female and as a tick mark in an age range. And this is a pain to try to figure out if you don't know what the census headings, and sometimes they're so hard to read. There is a link right here to where you can print out the census headings for any census record. And when I'm looking at the 1790 to 1840 censuses, I always print out the census headings and I copy the information from the original census onto the census form. So here's an example of what I do. If I wanted to track the Wiley and Isabel Tipton that I found in the 1850 Yancey County census, I have to compare them with two men by the name of Wiley Tipton who pop up in the 1840 census in Yancey County. So which one do I follow? Remember, I'm not going to pay any attention to spelling. We're going to ignore the fact that that's T-Y-P. We're not going to worry about that. Wiley Tipton Jr., you would automatically think, okay, he's the son of Wiley Tipton Esquire down here. But don't quickly jump to conclusions. Junior usually means the son is named after his father, but it can also just mean that there are two men in that area that have the same name, and we're going to refer to the younger one as Junior, even if they have no relationship at all between the two men. So we're going to go back to the 1850 census, and we're going to determine which Wiley Tipton and his wife was between 30 and 40 years old. Because remember, in this one right here, this Wiley Tipton has two male children under 5. He's 20 to 30. There's a female 15 to 20 and a female 20 to 30. So this is probably not a child. This may be a sister or somebody they brought in to help take care of the kids. Not sure. So you're looking for a wife in 1850 who's between 30 and 40 years old. And do either of them have two male sons in 1850 between 10 and 15? Remember that 5-year spread between David Tipton and his older brother, John? It's probably that only one of the two male children under 5 lived, and the other one died before the 1850 census. That would be why there was a gap between David MC Tipton and older brother John. The 1840 census also has a second page that you don't want to forget about. It has a category for pensioners for the Revolutionary War. So you might find your ancestor if they received a pension, which will lead you to military records. And then there are other census schedules that can provide fantastic information. There's mortality schedules that are from 1850 to 1880, and they can list people who died. They do list people who died during the previous 12 months of when a census was taken in the year prior to the federal census. The easiest way to find the mortality index is to Google what you want to find. We want to find US mortality schedules, family search, and they have a link to Ancestry's mortality index. And sometimes you get really lucky and it will have a link to the original. So here's a typical mortality schedule. Listen to the information you can learn in 1850, which is many years before the southern states had any vital records, or at least where I've looked. In the 1850 mortality schedule for Yancey County, North Carolina, 1850, the first entry is for a Thomas Lloyd. He was 76 years old, male, white, free, married, born in Georgia, died in November. He was a saddler for a profession, and he died suddenly of apoplexy, which is another word for stroke. What a jackpot to find that. There's also other census schedules. This is a agricultural schedule you can find between 1850 and 1880, and it's a list of farmers and their farms. You can discover what crops they raised, what livestock was owned, how many acres were owned, if the land was improved. Agricultural schedules can also show you the impact the Civil War had on a Southern family. You compare the 1860 agricultural schedule to the 1870, and you can see how devastating that Civil War was on a family. Industrial or manufacturing schedules give you information on businesses and industries. This is a time range for them. The 1850 and 1860 census was the first time that enslaved information was recorded separately. While the enslaved were usually not named, it was usually the slave owner, there is valuable information that was included, such as age, sex, color, fugitives, the number of slaves that were freed by a slave owner. So that is a good source. And lastly, there are state censuses. There were 38 states that created state censuses that were taken at the state level rather than the federal. And usually it would be, instead of the federal was usually like 1850, 1860, 1870, 1880. The state censuses were usually the 5-year mark, like 1885 or 1875. So you want to check in Family Search to see if your state has, your state of research has state censuses. So in closing, let's review our objectives for this presentation. We looked at some historical background on why it's more difficult to research in the South. The South was based on an agrarian society, which means there were more rural communities and they were spread out. There was no compulsory education, so usually only the wealthy could pay for tutors. Remember, less education, less records. The predominant religions in the South were Baptists and Methodists, and they recorded less records than other denominations. There's more burned counties because of war and other natural disasters that caused less records. Number two, some of the best go-to records for Southern research records to research in the South are the census, vital records, cemetery, land, military, probate, and tax records. And lastly, we focused on the value of census records in Southern research. They're a good place to start. You want to work backwards. You want to find every census your ancestor and their family could have been in during their lifetime. So in part two, this is just part one, I'll focus on some of the other go-to record types for Southern research. Here are some sources that I used. And here is my contact information. If any of you have questions that weren't answered, then you can email me. That's my home email address. Or you can contact me at the BYU Family History Library, where I serve as one of many volunteers that help people with various that help people that need some, where do I go next? Or how do I solve this problem? There's many volunteers there with specialties that are quite impressive that can help you. So I'm there every Friday, 10 to 5. If you ever wanted to contact me, you would have to have Zoom on your computer. And that's it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Laura. We'll open up the chat and the Q&A for questions. Karen Harrison says, what program did you use for the census survey graph?
I just created it out of my, it wasn't Google Sheets. It was just a regular Word document, and I just inserted a table. That was all I did. So if you go, like I have, You just insert a table, you put the number of boxes that you want, number of columns, and then you can expand it or add and delete as you go. It's just the easiest way I have found. I know that a lot of people use Google Sheets or Excel for that, but it's easier for me if I'm not doing a huge one just to create a table inside of my Word document.
All right, if there aren't any more questions, we'll go ahead and close.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on Thursday, September 29th with Sarah Cochran. She will be giving a presentation entitled Missing Reward, Locating Widows, Spinsters, and Bachelors. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.